Preface and Epigraph to Stories of the Royal Humane Society. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. Preface and Epigraph. In the preparation of this book, I received great assistance from Captain Home, late Secretary of the Royal Humane Society, who furnished me with valuable information and gave me access to the records of the institution. My thanks are also due to the Right Honourable Marquis of Breadalbane, Thomas Ornett Brassey, Esquire, and Mr. W. C. Bradley, for particulars of the rescues for which they were awarded medals, and also for permission to reproduce their photographs. Note to 5th edition. I wish to take this opportunity of thanking Major F. A. C. Claughton, Captain Holmes' successor, for his kindness in placing at my disposal particulars of the more recent acts of gallantry for which the Royal Humane Society has awarded medals. Signed, Frank Mundell. For there is much not born to die, great deeds can never be undone. Their splendour yet must fill our sky, like stars outlasting e'en the sun. 10,000 years may come and go, but not to move them from their place. Through them new lands will learn and know why God once shaped the English race. Such deeds are England's soul, and we, tossing aside each idler rhyme, should pour forth song to keep them free from the concealing dust of time. Sir Francis Doyle. End of Preface and Epigraph. Chapter 1 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Royal Humane Society. Death may usurp on nature many hours, and yet the fire of life kindle again. More than 2 centuries ago Shakespeare wrote these words, and in so doing he anticipated by about 100 years one of the greatest discoveries of medical science. The art of resuscitating the apparently dead does not seem to have been known to the ancients, and the first recorded instances of recovery from drowning in this country date back to 1650, nearly 40 years after the death of the great dramatist. Strange as it may appear to us, these cases excited no public interest, and it was not till about the middle of the 18th century that any serious investigations were made on the subject. At that period, Dr. Fothergill, one of the greatest physicians of the day, turned his attention to the question, and after most careful study he came to the conclusion that the methods used for determining death were entirely wrong. In a paper which he communicated to the Royal Society, he maintained that it was possible to save many lives without risking anything. The medical world, however, was not ready to adopt this theory. The general belief was that when breathing ceased, life was at an end. On the Continent, the publication of Dr. Fothergill's paper attracted much attention. In 1767, several successful attempts at resuscitation were made in Switzerland, and in the same year a Society for the Recovery of the Apparently Drowned was formed in Amsterdam. In 1773 the transactions of this society were translated by an English doctor named Cogan, with a view to convincing the people of this country that the scheme was perfectly practicable. The book fell into the hands of Dr. Hawes, who took up the idea with all the enthusiasm of a great mind. He publicly offered rewards to persons who, between London and Westminster bridges, should, within a certain period of the occurrence of an accident, rescue the bodies of drowned persons and bring them to places on shore appointed for their reception, in order that the means of resuscitation might be tried. At these places he and his friends restored several persons. During the first year of this experiment, Dr. Hawes paid these rewards out of his own pocket, but at the end of that time Dr. Cogan showed him that such an arrangement could not last, and offered to join with him in the formation of a Humane Society. After much trouble, 32 gentlemen were induced to join in the enterprise, and so in 1774 the present splendid institution was founded. Dr. Hawes exerted himself to the utmost to promote the success of the new society. He arranged its business, looked after its interests, and compiled the annual reports. The first volume was dedicated to King George III, who had showed from the first a great interest in the work. The methods taken to make known the objects of the society were very much the same as those with which we are familiar at the present day. On the first anniversary, the Society publicly exhibited 10 persons who had been thus snatched from death. One of the 10 had been under water for 15 minutes, and nearly an hour elapsed before proper medical treatment could be obtained. Yet he recovered after 4 hours' continuous application of the methods of the Society. The annual sermon preached on behalf of the Society was another feature of the management of those early days. To the end of his life, Dr. Hawes worked with the most praiseworthy zeal to make the institution popular. To his untiring labours, the English nation is indebted for the formation of a society which, whether we reflect on its purposes or its success, does honour to our country and exhibits most impressively the power of a single mind to accomplish objects of the most benign character and extensive utility. The first efforts of the Society were confined to the restoration of persons apparently drowned, but before long it extended its operations, and there seemed to be no form of accidental death with which it could not deal successfully. Cases of poisoning and the recovery of persons who had been struck by lightning were treated with great success, and Dr. Fothergill had the pleasure of seeing in use the means he had recommended nearly 30 years before. At the anniversary festival, held on the 15th of April 1806, it was unanimously agreed to present the gold medal of the Society to Alexander I, Emperor of Russia, by whose noble, unwearied and persevering efforts life was, under divine providence, restored to one of his subjects, who otherwise would have been prematurely consigned to the grave. The service to which the above refers took place on the banks of the river Vilna. On his progress through Poland, His Majesty became separated from his attendants, and seeing a crowd on the bank of the river, he was prompted by curiosity to approach and see what had happened. He found that the body of a man, apparently lifeless, had just been taken from the water. The Emperor ordered the bearers to lay the body down, and helped to remove the clothes. He then with his own hands tried by rubbing to restore animation. While he was so engaged, some members of his suite came upon the scene. Among them was Dr. Weir, an English surgeon who was in constant attendance on His Majesty. He bled the patient and did everything in his power to restore him. After 3 hours' continuous rubbing, the man gave no sign of life, and Weir gave it as his opinion that the man was dead. The Emperor, however, persevered in his efforts, and at last he had the inexpressible satisfaction of hearing the man groan, upon which he exclaimed in French, "Thank God, this is the brightest day of my life." His Majesty remained with the man till he had quite recovered, and before he left he gave him a sum of money. The gold medal was sent in accordance with the resolution, and His Imperial Majesty was graciously pleased to accept the same. George III manifested a deep interest in the institution, and was one of its first patrons. His Majesty, however, was not content to be merely a figurehead, and was determined to show that his sympathy was of a practical nature. At that time many drowning accidents occurred in the Serpentine, a large sheet of water in Hyde Park, and the King thought that if there was some place near at hand to which rescued persons could be taken for treatment, it would prove a great boon, and be the means of saving many lives. He therefore granted the Society a plot of ground in Hyde Park, on the north side of the Serpentine, for the erection of a receiving house, where cases of suspended animation might have prompt and judicious medical aid. A picture of this building, in the possession of the Society, shows it to have been a 2-storey erection surrounded by trees and bushes like a farmhouse. In 1834 the old building gave place to the present house, the first stone of which was laid by the Duke of Wellington. Though the Royal Humane Society was founded by doctors who were anxious to propagate their plans for restoring suspended animation, it gave rewards to those who succeeded in rescuing persons in danger of being drowned, and this phase of its operations is that with which we are most familiar. As an acknowledgment of the bravery of those who risk their lives to save their fellow creatures from death, the Society awards medals and testimonials. The Stanhope Gold Medal, the highest award, comes out of a fund raised by the friends and admirers of the late Captain Chandos Scudamore Stanhope of the Royal Navy, who died in 1871. To commemorate his services to his profession, it was thought that there could not be a more suitable mode of keeping his memory green than by the gift of an annual gold medal to be awarded by the Royal Humane Society. The Stanhope Gold Medal is given each year to the bearer of the Silver Medal who has shown the greatest gallantry during the year. Its wearers are the very bravest of the brave. Previous to 1873, the Society had awarded gold medals for special cases as occasion required. The Silver Medal is awarded for saving life from drowning or asphyxia in mines, wells, etc., under circumstances of very great danger. The bronze medal is awarded for courage and promptitude in saving life under circumstances of danger or personal risk. Testimonials on vellum or on parchment are awarded when no great risk has been incurred. A second act of bravery is usually recognised by a clasp, either for the silver or the bronze medal. Money rewards are only paid in cases which occur within 30 miles of the metropolis. It is an important fact to remember that soldiers and sailors are allowed to wear the medals and clasps of the Royal Humane Society, an honour granted to no other civil decoration in the country. On one side of the medal is the figure of a boy blowing an extinguished torch in the hope that peradventure a little spark may yet lie hid. Latiat scintillula forsan. From the earliest times, flame has been regarded as the emblem of life, and its extinction as the symbol of death. The design is therefore appropriate, either to the person apparently dead, or to the one who endeavours to resuscitate him. Underneath is an abbreviated inscription in Latin. The inscription round it expresses the merit which obtains this honour from the Society. He has obtained this reward for having saved the life of a citizen. Within the garland is the following inscription in an abbreviated Latin form: The Royal Humane Society presented this gift for saving life. Should the medal be presented to any one who has been unsuccessful in saving life, the inscription reads: The Royal Humane Society presented this to, his life having been exposed to danger. The name of the hero is engraved round the edge of the medal. In 1882, a new and important feature was instituted in the operations of the Society, when it was decided to offer a silver medal annually for competition in public schools and training ships to encourage proficiency in saving life from drowning. Competitions are now held every year, and, by using a dummy to represent a body, the youths are becoming very expert in the art of rescuing both on the surface and under water. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A brave foreman. There are few places which seem to us less likely to be the scene of a display of courage than that in which occurred the most remarkable instance of bravery brought before the Royal Humane Society in 1894. Shipwrecks, fires, and mining disasters are associated in our minds with romantic heroism and pathetic incident. But the mention of a town sewer carries with it no suggestion of a daring deed. About 9:30 on the night of the 19th of October 1894, a number of workmen were sent to carry out some repairs in the interior of the main sewer at Torquay. The night was considered favourable for the work, and as all needful precautions had been taken for the safety of the workers, they went down the manhole without a thought of danger. Between 11 and 12 they came to the surface and had supper. As they were returning, the foreman, William Mugford, noticed that the sky looked black and threatening, and he told his men that what they had to do must be done quickly. An examination was made of the dam, which had been erected to divert the stream from the spot where they had to work, and it was found that the water had risen 2 inches. But as the inward flow had ceased, the men, after carefully considering the matter, decided to return to their work. As a further precaution, however, they left a man at the bottom of the manhole with a red light to warn them if the water should rise. Back to their work they went, and for 2 hours they proceeded rapidly with the task in hand. Meanwhile, a violent thunderstorm had burst over Torquay. The rain fell in torrents. Vivid flashes of lightning were followed by loud and long peals of thunder. From all parts of the town the flood rushed with terrific force into the main sewer, and the water rose about 3 feet in as many minutes. Some idea of the nature of the downpour may be formed from the fact that 1 inch and a half of rain fell during the 7 hours the storm lasted. So far nothing had happened to cause the workers any alarm, but just as the mason was in the act of laying the last brick, a shout was heard and the dreaded red light was seen approaching. One of the workmen threw down his tools and ran to see what was the matter. A moment more and his warning shout, "Come on, the water is rising fast," told them that their lives were in danger. Some of the workmen ran towards the nearest manhole, leaving Mugford and another man named Mildon to secure the staging on which they had been working. Down rushed the water in a perfect torrent, overflowing the dam and whirling down the sewer with terrific force. One of the men succeeded in getting hold of a barrow which was fastened to the dam, and clung to it for dear life. By means of a lifeline he was hauled up by his companions. Another man who was behind him must have been overpowered and carried away. Not a cry did he utter, nor was anything seen of him until his dead body was afterwards found entangled among the staging on which he had been working. In the meantime, Mugford and Mildon were making their way as best they could up the sewer, the foreman, a well-built, powerful man, lending a helping hand to his less stalwart companion. For some distance they made good progress, but immediately they encountered the full force of the current, they found it was utterly impossible to battle against it. Mugford, knowing that their only hope of escape lay in reaching a shaft at some distance farther down, gave the word to turn about, and made for the place of safety. Again and again would Mildon have been swept off his feet and carried away, had it not been for the support of the brave fellow beside him. Suddenly Mildon was seized in a powerful grasp. It was that of another workman named Potter, who, having failed to reach the manhole, was being borne down the stream to destruction. The unexpected shock almost caused both men to lose their footing. With a heroism equal to that of his companion, Mildon called out to Mugford, "Let me go," but the foreman, exerting his great strength to the utmost, held on to them both. Half swimming and half running, the 3 men were borne along. Mildon and Potter had lost their candles, but Mugford still had a precious piece of a few inches in length. That bit of candle saved their lives, for it enabled them to see their way past the staging where they had been at work, and when they arrived at the shaft, it showed them the chains to which they must lay hold or be swept away. During this trying time, Mugford never for an instant lost his presence of mind. He shouted to his companions to "mind the chains." Mildon missed the first, but caught the second. The foreman and Potter secured the first. Hoisting himself onto the platform, Mugford dragged up his companions, who were thoroughly exhausted, and so saved them from a horrible death. There they remained, wet to the skin and in total darkness for 7 hours before they were finally rescued. The men above ground, probably believing that their comrades were all drowned and thinking that nothing could be done, took no steps to organise a rescue party, and it was not until Mr. Garrett, the Borough Surveyor, was communicated with about 8 o'clock that the first news of the accident was known. A rescue party with the necessary tackle was at once dispatched. William Raymond volunteered to go down the shaft, and he was lowered by means of a rope. Food and restoratives were also sent down to the men. Raymond had not been long down the shaft when he returned to the surface with the sad news that one of the men was missing. "Where are the other 3?" asked the Borough Surveyor. "Hadn't you better send them up?" "They won't come, sir," replied Raymond. "They want to look for their mate." This was indeed true. Exhausted as they were, they proceeded along the sewer till they found the body of their comrade. Then they consented to be drawn up. The conduct of Mugford in saving the lives of Mildon and Potter at the risk of his own is beyond praise, and in awarding him the Stanhope Gold Medal, the Royal Humane Society only carried out the wishes of all who had read the story of his heroism. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hero of the Water Nymph. One night in December 1884, a lugger named the Water Nymph sailed from the small fishing town of Looe on the coast of Cornwall. The little vessel was proceeding to the fishing ground off the Eddystone lighthouse under the command of her captain, Alfred Collins. The night was very dark and the sea was in one of its angriest moods. A gale of wind was blowing at the time, and the great waves of the Atlantic, mountains high, rolled up the channel with terrific force and beat with deafening roar on the rock-bound coast. As the storm increased in violence, the lugger pitched about to an alarming extent, and the crew were obliged to hold on to prevent being thrown overboard. Then there came a sudden lurch, and a boy named Hosking was pitched into the sea. The vessel was drifting at the time, and would soon be far away from the drowning boy, unless he was speedily rescued. But what could anyone do on a night so dark, and in the face of such a storm? Every man in the Water Nymph was a brave British sailor, who never shrank from risking his own life to save a fellow creature from drowning where there was the slightest hope of success. But in this instance every man felt that the lad could not be saved, and that a certain death awaited anyone who would dare to plunge into those dark and turbulent waters. That was the opinion of the crew, but the young captain thought differently. In vain the men begged of him not to run the terrible risk of attempting a rescue. He could not let the lad drown without any effort to save him, and he at once plunged into the boiling waters which surged around the vessel. Striking out in the direction of the lad, Collins was absent a few minutes, when he returned to the lugger and climbed on deck. The crew were greatly relieved when they saw him, and concluded that he had given up the idea as impossible. But they were mistaken. He had only returned for a rope to aid him in his work of mercy. Before he left the vessel a second time, the crew used every effort to persuade him not to risk his life again, but their pleading words fell on deaf ears. The lad had been committed to his care, and he would rather die than leave him to perish without making every effort to save him. Calmly selecting a rope long enough for his purpose, Collins wound one end round his arm and once more disappeared in the angry waters. He was a first-rate swimmer, but he required all his strength and skill to live in such a sea, and for some time he beat about in all directions, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy. At length he saw something on the surface of the waves about 80 feet from the boat. With a last hope that it might be the object of his search, he made a desperate effort. When he reached the floating mass, he found that it was indeed the lad, who was just about to sink for the last time. Seizing the poor fellow, Collins, assisted by the crew pulling the rope, bore him to the vessel, and he was taken on board more dead than alive. The rescued and his noble rescuer were carefully tended by the crew, and both soon recovered from the effects of the terrible ordeal through which they had passed. A few months afterwards, a great meeting was held in the town hall to do honour to the brave Cornishman, who was received by his friends and neighbours with rounds of hearty cheers. No one knew better than did those hardy seamen the daring character of the brave deed that Collins had successfully achieved. Lady Trelawney, who could not attend the meeting, wrote, "Will you tell them how sorry I am to deprive myself of the pleasure of doing honour to one whom I am proud to regard as a Cornishman and a neighbour, and whom I consider to be a hero quite as really as those who win the Victoria Cross in war." At the end of the meeting, Collins, in the dress he had worn on that memorable night, stood up and expressed his thanks for all the kind things that had been said about him, and hoped he should be ready to do the same duty if occasion arose. A short time after this, the Royal Humane Society awarded Collins the Stanhope Gold Medal, and it was presented to him by the hand of the mother of the lad whose life he had saved. The brave fisherman received the medal with pride, but he set a far higher value on the thankful words of the grateful mother, who asked God to bless him for his bravery. For this gallant deed, the name of Alfred Collins has been written on the nation's roll of honour, and the story of that dark December night will not soon be forgotten. But better even than the act of bravery was the motive which prompted him to risk his life. In that supreme moment he had but one thought, and that was a desire to do his duty. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A famous swimmer. On the 22nd of April 1873, while the steamship Russia was crossing the Atlantic on a voyage from New York to Liverpool, a sailor named Michael Haines fell from the rigging into the sea. A stiff breeze was blowing at the time, and the vessel was cutting through the water at a rate of 14½ knots an hour. Immediately on perceiving what had happened, another sailor named Matthew Webb jumped overboard to the rescue. Haines was by this time a considerable distance astern, and making desperate efforts to keep afloat. Knowing that there was not a moment to lose, Webb swam with all speed towards the unfortunate man, but before he could reach him he had sunk to rise no more. A seaman's cap tossing on the waves marked the place where he had gone down, and Webb dived several times in the hope of recovering the body, but without success. Meanwhile the steamer had been stopped and a boat lowered to assist in the work of rescue. Webb was picked up about half a mile away, and then the sailors continued to row round the spot for some time, keeping a bright lookout in all directions, in the hope that Haynes might be found. But in vain, and they eventually returned to the ship. Though he had suffered somewhat from cold, the brave swimmer was not in the least exhausted by his great exertions, and to the surprise of everyone, after changing his wet clothes, he resumed his duties on deck as if nothing unusual had happened. To show their admiration of Webb's bravery, the passengers on board the Russia made a subscription on his behalf, and in an hour they presented the hero with the sum of £100 in acknowledgment of the plucky attempt that he had made to save his shipmate's life at the risk of his own. Another subscription was also set on foot, for the benefit of the widow and children of the lost man, to which Webb also contributed. When the Russia arrived in England, all the facts of the case became known, and an account of the occurrence was laid before the Royal Humane Society. Though Webb had not succeeded in saving life, the institution showed their appreciation of his gallant act by awarding him the Stanhope Gold Medal, the first that had ever been given. The presentation was made by the Duke of Edinburgh, who said, "I am sure it will afford you all great gratification, as it certainly does me, to see so gallant a man receive this distinction for his brave conduct. I have the greatest pleasure, Webb, at being the medium of placing it in your possession." Though this daring deed brought Webb into public notice, it is as one of the most extraordinary swimmers of modern times, rather than as a Stanhope Gold Medalist, that he is best known. In the limited space at our disposal, we can, however, only refer to the two most famous performances which are linked with his name. These are his great Channel swim and his attempt to cross the whirlpool at Niagara Falls. About 1 o'clock on Tuesday, the 24th of August, 1875, Captain Webb, as he was now called, jumped off the Admiralty Pier at Dover amid the cheers of a great crowd of spectators. Accompanied by a lugger and two stout rowing boats, he struck out into the Channel. The day was warm and the sea was perfectly calm, and in about 2 hours he had left the white, dear cliffs of Dover far behind. During the next 8 hours Webb continued to breast the Channel with undiminished vigour, only pausing now and again for a cup of beef tea or hot coffee. In reply to the questions of his friends in the boats as to how he was feeling, he replied, "All right." Shortly after 9 o'clock he called out that a jellyfish had stung him, and to prevent any evil consequences the wound was rubbed with brandy. About midnight the mail steamer, on her way to Calais, passed near the swimmer, and as the passengers and crew caught sight of him they raised cheer after cheer, which, as Webb declared, raised the heart within him and gave him fresh strength and courage. He had now been 12 hours in the water, and had reached a point about 9 miles from the French shore. Throughout the night a skilled diver sat in the bow of one of the boats, ready at a moment's notice to spring to Webb's assistance should cramp or exhaustion make such an aid necessary. When morning broke, his friends saw that the long exposure was beginning to tell, and they began to fear that, after all, the attempt would end in failure. Strange to say, as time went on, Webb took less and less nourishment, though the hardest part of his task was yet to come. About 5 o'clock a wind sprang up, which dashed the waves in the swimmer's face, and greatly impeded his progress. After struggling on bravely for a time, he called out, "The wind is killing me by inches." He no longer struck out with his former vigour. His face looked grey and aged, and it was apparent to those in the boats that success or failure would be decided in a few minutes. Suddenly a hearty British cheer rang out across the waves. It came from some of the sailors of the mail steamer which had passed him the night before, and who now had come out in a small boat to see the finish of the plucky swim. Pulling to windward, they placed their boat between him and the waves, and cheered him on as only sailors can. There was now no doubt about the issue of the struggle. The shore was only half a mile distant, and Webb nerved himself for a final spurt. Yard by yard he approached the goal of his ambition, cheered at almost every stroke by an excited crowd on the beach. Yard by yard he lessened the distance, until at length he touched the ground. Being too weak to stand, he fell down, thoroughly exhausted. 2 men rushed into the water and helped him ashore. It was then 41 minutes past 10, and Webb had been swimming for 21 hours and 3/4. What mattered aches and pains? He had accomplished his object, and that more than repaid him for all his exertions. He was put to bed at once, and left in charge of a medical man. On the following morning he awoke almost as fresh as if nothing unusual had happened. He therefore returned to England, where he received a most enthusiastic welcome. "I can only say," Webb afterwards remarked, when speaking of his great swim, "that the moment when I touched the Calais sands and felt the French soil beneath my feet is one that I shall never forget were I to live for 100 years. I was terribly exhausted at the time, and during the last 2 or 3 hours I began to think that, after all, I should fail. On the following day, after I had had a good night's rest, I did not feel very much the worse for what I had undergone. I had a peculiar sensation in my limbs, somewhat similar to that which is often felt after the first week of the cricket season, and it was a week before I could wear a shirt collar, owing to the red raw rim at the back of my neck, caused by being obliged to keep my head back for so long a period." For some years Matthew Webb continued to perform swimming feats, which not only filled the spectators with wonder, but also called forth the unbounded admiration of all who heard of these marvellous displays of pluck and endurance. These performances are far more deserving of being recorded in a book of daring deeds than his attempt to swim across Niagara, an enterprise which even the most friendly critic cannot characterise as anything but foolhardy. We, however, include it more as a warning than as an example for imitation. The brave man is not he who rushes aimlessly into danger without regard to the risk, but he who, knowing the risk, braves the danger that he may accomplish some good action. At 4 o'clock on the 24th of July 1883, Webb dived into the water from a boat stationed at a point a little distance above the old suspension bridge, and was at once carried down the rapids at a terrific pace. In a few minutes he was in a most turbulent part of the current, where at one moment he was lifted high on the crest of a wave, and at the next he sank into the awful hollow. Several times he was struck by a wave, and for a few seconds disappeared from sight. Once he was drawn under by the current, and when he reappeared he was 150 yards down the river. More than once a cry of despair was wrung from the spectators who lined the banks. Scarcely 10 minutes had passed since he entered the water, when, at a frightful speed, he was swept into the neck of the whirlpool. For one moment his head was seen above the angry waters, but to all appearance he was absolutely at the mercy of the furious current. This was the last time that he was seen alive. His body was afterwards found 4 miles farther down the river. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Other Stanhope medalists. In looking over the names of those who have been awarded the highest honour which the Royal Humane Society has in its power to bestow, we are struck by the fact that the prize has been carried off by soldiers and sailors 15 times out of a possible 22. A policeman has secured the honour once, while on the other occasions the awards have been made to private individuals. The greater number of the medals have been given for saving life by jumping overboard. This is not surprising when we remember the conditions under which such a deed must be accomplished. The rescuer places his life entirely at the mercy of circumstances, and he runs many dangers in addition to that ordinarily attendant on rescuing a drowning person. After he has left the ship, some time must necessarily elapse before it can be hove to and a boat lowered, and should anything go wrong in the meantime, his life is likely to pay the forfeit. On the night of the 10th of September 1874, a yacht named the Dart was making for her moorings in the harbour at Lowestoft. In passing through the gateway which connects the outer and inner harbour, one of the sailors fell overboard. The moment that the alarm was given, Lieutenant de Houghton, an officer of the 10th Foot, jumped from the deck and swam to the man's assistance. The place where the accident occurred was a long narrow opening, through which the water was rushing with considerable force. De Houghton reached the man and swam with him to the side of the gateway, in the hope of finding something to lay hold of till help arrived, but there was neither side chains nor cross beams, nor was there any other vessel near from which he could obtain assistance. The night was so dark that there was no chance of help from the shore, so the lieutenant saw that there was nothing to do but to wait till his friends had moored the yacht and could return to his aid. For a quarter of an hour he supported the man in his arms till they came down the pier with ropes and dragged them both ashore. The well-known self-sacrificing spirit of our sailors had a splendid illustration on the 26th of November 1874, when a bluejacket fell overboard from HMS Raleigh in mid-ocean. Sub-Lieutenant Rogers, who saw the accident, immediately jumped into the water and swam towards the man. The ship was hove to, and the lifeboat was promptly lowered. Manned by a crew of lusty tars, the boat soon overtook Rogers, and the men, thinking that he had fallen overboard, lay on their oars to pick him up. Seeing their mistake, the gallant fellow shouted to them to pull on in the direction of a cap which was floating to leeward. The men obeyed, and for more than a quarter of an hour they rowed about in a vain endeavour to find their missing comrade. He, poor fellow, had struck the side of the ship in his fall and had gone straight to the bottom. Meanwhile, Rogers kept himself afloat till the boat returned and picked him up. Some idea of the plucky nature of this adventure may be formed from the fact that it took the sailors nearly an hour to pull back to the ship. Vice Admiral the Hon. Edmund Freemantle, while captain on board HMS Invincible in February 1880, rescued one of the crew under circumstances of unusual difficulty. Between Alexandria and Aboukir Bay, a sailor fell overboard, and the gallant captain plunged in to his rescue from the bridge. Just as he reached him the man sank, but Freemantle dived, brought the unfortunate fellow to the surface, and with great difficulty kept him afloat till the arrival of a boat. The Stanhope Gold Medal was a fitting recognition of so distinguished a service. On the 6th of April 1877, HMS Immortalite was bowling along before the wind when a seaman fell overboard. Sub-Lieutenant Montgomery, who was on the bridge at the moment, jumped into the sea from a height of 25 feet. On reaching the man, he turned him on his back and swam with him towards the ship, hoping to find a lifebuoy. It was a dark night, and he missed it. After keeping the man afloat for some time, he told him to lie still while he took off his clothes. Montgomery quickly removed his coat and shirt, but when he was in the act of taking off his trousers, the man felt himself sinking, caught hold of him by the leg, and dragged him down a considerable distance. Luckily the officer's trousers came off clear, and he rose again to the surface, bringing the man with him. The last plunge, however, had rendered the bluejacket insensible, and thus greatly increased his weight. Finding no help near, and seeing that his only chance to save himself was to swim for it, Montgomery reluctantly gave up the hope of saving his companion and struck out for the ship. Meanwhile 2 boats had been sent out to search for him, and he was at length picked up by one of them, after having been 20 minutes in the water, exposed to death in one of its most dreaded aspects. Lieutenant Wince of HMS Raleigh, by a similar act of bravery, won the Stanhope Medal off the island of Tenedos in 1877. One of the sailors fell from aloft into the sea, when the lieutenant jumped overboard and supported the unconscious fellow for 20 minutes till a boat came to his assistance. When picked up, the man was found to have sustained serious injuries in his fall, a circumstance which greatly enhances the value of the lieutenant's action. The sailor's most dreaded enemy is without doubt Jack Shark, and they wisely avoid coming into contact with such an obliging customer, who, as the saying goes, has always room for an inside passenger. But when life is at stake, they throw all these prudent considerations to the winds, and dare the sea tiger to do his worst. It is indeed astonishing to find how often the brave fellows have succeeded in baffling this horrid enemy. On the 28th of January 1883, HMS Harrier was lying at anchor in Pomomi Harbour, Joanna Island. The night was pitch dark, with a choppy sea, and the force of the wind was so strong that any ordinary noises were almost inaudible on board. Looking casually over the side, William Simpson, captain of the foretop, thought he could distinguish a figure in the water. Fearing that one of the men had fallen overboard, he called the lifeboat's crew and jumped into the sea. He found the man almost insensible, and supported him above water till help arrived. The danger incurred by Simpson was of no slight nature. The harbour swarmed with sharks, and only the previous day a large one had been seen alongside the ship. Another rescue in a shark-infested sea was performed on the 13th of September 1885 by Walter Cleverley, a passenger on board the steamship Weir, while that vessel was proceeding through the Gulf of Aden at the rate of 13 knots an hour. A lascar had fallen overboard, and when Cleverley heard the cry, he jumped from the poop, a distance of nearly 30 feet, and swam to the rescue. He seized the man and supported him in his arms for 40 minutes, till a boat from the Weir picked them up. Alfred John Cooper, second officer of the Peninsular and Oriental steamship Kaiser I. Hind, who recently lost his life in a courageous attempt to save a drowning lascar, displayed during his only too brief career an amount of pluck and heroism not often seen even among Stanhope medalists. In April 1890, while the P&O steamship Massilia was on the voyage from Bombay to London, a lascar fell overboard. Cooper was in the saloon at the time, but hearing the cry, "A man overboard!" he rushed on deck and swam to the rescue. He succeeded in reaching the man and supported him till a boat came to his assistance. For this rescue he was awarded the Stanhope Gold Medal, and shortly afterwards he added to his laurels by winning the Albert Medal. On the unfortunate occasion which ended with his death, Cooper had gone to save a lascar who had fallen overboard. A boat was promptly lowered to follow him, but something went wrong. The delay was fatal, for the brave fellow's life paid the penalty. On the 15th of December 1890, the Indian Marine Survey ship Investigator was trawling in the Bay of Bengal. During the day 2 sharks were seen swimming round the vessel, and the sailors determined to enjoy a little sport by angling for them. A boat hook was accordingly lowered, and in a few minutes one of the monsters was caught. The gunner brought his rifle with the intention of shooting it, but slipped and fell into the sea. Knowing that he could not swim, William Huddleston, the officer in command, jumped overboard and seized hold of the gunner the moment he came to the surface. Both were quickly drawn on board. Some idea of the risk the officer ran in effecting the rescue may be formed from the fact that at the bow lay the captive shark, 7 feet long, while the second was in attendance not far off. Huddleston received the Stanhope Medal. An even more remarkable instance of gallantry took place on the 9th of September 1892. The cutter of HMS Swallow was cruising off the south end of Zanzibar Island. About 6 o'clock in the evening, half of the crew landed to prepare supper. The others, who had nothing better to do, decided to go in for a swim, except 2 men who were left in charge of the boat. Suddenly a large shark was seen a few yards off, making in the direction of the bathers. It was evident that before they could reach the boat the shark would be upon them. In the hope of distracting the monster's attention, and thus giving his comrades time to escape, Thomas McDermott, boatswain of the Swallow, without a moment's hesitation plunged into the sea, actually diving right over the shark. This had the desired effect. Frightened by the splash, the fish made off, and the men regained the boat in safety. Captain Scrays Dickens was journeying home on sick leave on board the steamship Peshawar, from Aden to Suez, when a lascar fell overboard. There was a strong head wind blowing, and the sea was running high, while the vessel was going at 11½ knots an hour. As if these circumstances did not constitute danger enough, the Red Sea is notoriously infested with sharks. To none of these things, however, did Captain Scrays Dickens, who happened to be sitting on a chair on deck, give a thought. Although suffering from seasickness, he at once jumped overboard to the rescue of the drowning man. A lifebuoy was thrown to him, which he secured. With this he swam to the lascar and supported him in the water for 17 minutes, until both were rescued by a boat. Owing to the speed at which the steamer was going, the men were left more than 1.5 miles behind when the boat reached them. Truly a deed of daring, for which the hero was awarded the Stanhope Gold Medal. India, the land of so many heroic exploits which in the past made the name of Englishmen famous in the East, has been the scene of many acts of humanity which form a striking and pleasing contrast to the death-dealing valour of our soldiers in the early part of the century. Example is universally acknowledged to be a better method of teaching than precept, and it would seem as if the Hindu may yet turn out an apt pupil. Early in 1878 the body of a native woman was being carried to a ghat on the Ganges for cremation, when suddenly she showed signs of returning animation. The bearers, terrified out of their wits, and thinking that she was possessed with an evil spirit, threw her into the river. A Hindu named Babu Christo Chunder Chakrabarti, who happened to be passing at the time, hearing the cry of "Boot, boot," or "Goblin, goblin," ran to the spot to see what had happened. To his surprise and horror, he saw a woman drowning, while on the bank stood a crowd of affrighted natives, yelling and gesticulating, but not making any endeavour to save her life. Chakrabarti, without waiting to ask questions, plunged into the river and swam to the woman's assistance. The place was a dangerous whirlpool, about 30 feet deep, and it required the greatest strength and skill to keep him from being drawn into the vortex of certain death. In effecting the rescue he was more than once under water, and, though the woman grasped at him with the terrible clasp of a drowning person, he succeeded in bringing her safely to shore and restoring her to her friends. It is considered that the loss of caste must follow the act of touching what might have been a corpse. Chakrabarti, therefore, in risking the native opinion, which might have reduced him to the position of an outcast from his friends, or compelled him to renew his caste by a severe penance, displayed an amount of courage quite at variance with the national character and ideas of his countrymen, and well deserving of the Stanhope Medal which he was awarded. On the 9th of February 1881, several gentlemen were proceeding by river from Moonshgunga to Silchar, when the boat struck on a rock. The party succeeded in landing safely, but the boat had to be abandoned. A short time afterwards, a large native vessel struck the hidden rock at the same place, and all on board were thrown into the water. Heedless of the risk he ran in venturing into the midst of 25 terror-stricken men and women, most of whom were totally unable to help themselves, Major Senior of the 34th Bengal Native Infantry swam out, and after repeated exertions succeeded in saving the lives of 6 persons and in winning the Stanhope Medal. Captain McRae, an officer of the 34th Sikhs, also won the medal by the rescue of a trumpeter of the Royal Artillery who had fallen into a well at Rowell Point. When the alarm was raised, McRae and several others went to the spot, and he allowed himself to be lowered by a tent rope. On reaching the water, he found the soldier almost insensible, and therefore decided to go up with him. He gave the signal to those at the surface to haul away, but they had only been raised about 15 feet when the rope broke and threw them both to the bottom of the well. A second attempt was fortunately successful. McRae incurred very great personal risk, for the depth of the well was 88 feet, 12 of which were water. The hero of 1889 was William Mayer, who gallantly volunteered to descend into a cylinder where 2 coolies lay insensible. Several natives were working under water at Kim Seng Bridge, Singapore, when a rush of foul gas entered the cylinder just as those men were returning to the surface. 2 of them fell insensible to the bottom, but the third man was drawn to the top in safety. Mayer went down, and seizing hold of one of the men brought him to the surface, but the poor fellow was dead. Down again went the plucky fellow in spite of the gas, which had nearly overpowered him, and brought up the second man alive, but he died in a few minutes. From time to time we hear of splendid acts of gallantry on the part of the Metropolitan Police, but they are not usually of a kind which will admit of recognition by the Royal Humane Society. There is, however, one of our city guardians who has the honour of wearing the Stanhope Gold Medal. About 3 o'clock on the morning of the 14th of July 1882, Constable John Jenkins was on duty on Waterloo Bridge, when he saw a man mount the parapet and throw himself into the river. The tide was running out under the arches at the rate of 6 miles an hour, and a thick mist covered the water, rendering it impossible to see any object in the centre of the river from either side, and the distance from the parapet to the water was 43 feet. Jenkins knew the danger, and he also knew his duty. Without any hesitation he unfastened his belt, jumped from the bridge, and seized the would-be suicide in his firm grip. The poor wretch struggled with might and main to free himself, or to drag his rescuer down with him, but in vain. Jenkins succeeded in keeping the man's head above water, until a boat from the Thames Police Station picked them up in a very exhausted condition. In pursuit of our next hero, we must go to the Antipodes, where, in August 1875, 3 persons attempted to drive a gig across a bridge at Henbury, Tasmania. The river was flooded to such an extent that the water swept over the roadway. The trap had proceeded little more than half way across when the occupants were thrown into the water. Fortunately, they managed to cling to the bridge. Hearing their cries for help, a resident named Bennett Story plunged into the river and swam a distance of 70 yards to the spot. 3 times he performed the perilous swim, and succeeded in bringing them safely to land. Owing to the great exertions he had been compelled to make to stem the torrent, and to the extreme coldness of the water, for August is a winter month in Tasmania, he was completely exhausted. Not daring to cross the river to his own home, he hastened with all speed to the house of a friend 2 miles away, where he soon recovered from the effects of the exposure. Mr. Headley Hill received the Stanhope Medal for a rescue performed in October 1887. Owing to the darkness, a girl fell into the Avon at Bristol, and was being rapidly carried away by the current when her cries attracted Hill's attention. Without undressing, he jumped into the stream, and after great difficulty succeeded in bringing her to the bank. Albert Batterson is the youngest medallist on the list. We find him described as "Boy of HMS Impregnable." On the 29th of December 1887, a girl named Annie Freer attempted to cross the River Soar at Leicester on the ice, when it gave way and she fell through. Hearing her cries for help, a man attempted to go to her assistance, but returned before he had gone half way. Batterson then went on the ice and actually dived under it and seized hold of the girl. In coming up, he broke through the ice with his head, and succeeded in bringing the girl to the shore. The officer commanding the boy's ship states that he cannot imagine a greater risk than that attendant on the act, for, if the lad had not been able to break the ice, he would certainly have been drowned. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Heroine of Longstone. At the present day, the performance of a gallant rescue by a woman causes no unusual excitement. Time has taught us that there are brave women as well as fearless men. About 60 years ago the case was very different, and when one September morning the news came that some shipwrecked persons had been saved from destruction by the energy and pluck of a girl, the whole country went wild with excitement. Who was the heroine? The coast of Northumberland is one of the most dangerous parts of our shores. There the sea rushes with tremendous violence among the Farne Islands, on one of which, called the Longstone, stands a lighthouse. William Howett, who visited this island, said, "It was like the rest of these desolate isles, all of dark whinstone, cracked in every direction, and worn with the action of winds, waves, and tempests since the world began. On the greatest part of it there was not a blade of grass or a grain of earth, but bare and iron-like stone, crusted round the coast as far as high water mark with limpet and still smaller shells. We ascended wrinkled hills of black stone, and descended into worn and dismal dells of the same, into some of which, when the tide got entrance, it came pouring and roaring in raging whiteness, churning the loose fragments of the whinstone into round pebbles. Over our heads screamed hundreds of hovering birds, the gull mingling his laughter most wildly. On this desolate spot lived William Darling, the keeper of the lighthouse, with his wife and his daughter Grace. While her father trimmed the lamps and attended to his other duties, she assisted her mother in the housework. Having but little intercourse with the mainland, she knew comparatively nothing of what went on in the world, but for all that she was content and happy. Thus, unknowing and unknown, she lived till her 23rd year, when an incident happened which made her name a household word wherever the English language is spoken. On the night of the 5th of September 1838 a terrible storm was raging. The fury of the waves seemed to shake the lighthouse to its very foundations. Accustomed as Grace was to nature in her angriest moods, the violence of the tempest made a great impression on her mind, and before retiring for the night she expressed to her father a hope that if any mariners were near the coast they would see the light in time to avoid shipwreck. Meanwhile a steamer named the Forfarshire was on her way from Hull to Dundee. She had on board a valuable cargo of merchandise and 39 passengers, besides a crew of 24 men, 63 souls all told. When the storm was at its height, a leak showed itself in the boilers of the vessel. It gradually increased till the fires were put out and the engines were rendered useless. To prevent, if possible, the steamer from becoming totally unmanageable, sails were hoisted, but to no purpose. At the mercy of the winds and waves she drifted hither and thither. To make matters worse, a thick fog came on, accompanied by blinding showers of rain. Suddenly the mist lifted, and, to the horror of all on board, the Longstone light was seen. The captain made a desperate effort to steer his ship clear of the rocks, but it was too late, and in a few minutes the bow of the Forfarshire struck and remained fast on a steep and narrow ledge of rock. A terrible panic followed. Some rushed to the boats, and 9 persons succeeded in getting clear of the wreck. Others sought safety in various parts of the ship. In a short time a tremendous wave lifted the stern of the vessel and dashed it down on the sharp-edged rock, literally cutting the Forfarshire in two. The stern was swept away, and with it every soul who had taken refuge in that part of the vessel. The 9 survivors, who clung to the bow, set up a pitiful cry of terror when they saw what had happened, and gave themselves up for lost. Just at that moment Grace Darling was roused from sleep. Above the howling of the wind and the roaring of the sea came that awful shriek of agony. She sprang to her feet and peered anxiously through the gloom, but was unable to see anything. Going to her father, she told him that she feared some disaster had happened. As the dawn brightened, her fears were realised. By the aid of his glass, Darling saw the wreck about a mile distant. A few figures could also be made out, clinging to the sides. Grace urged her father to attempt a rescue, but to her surprise he said it was impossible. He was the only man in the lighthouse, and his unaided strength was not equal to managing a boat in such a sea. "Father," replied Grace, We must not let them perish. I will go in the boat with you, and God will give us success." In vain her father urged every objection, and explained to her the dangers which would be encountered. Grace persisted that a rescue must be attempted. Yielding at last, though sorely against his better judgment, Darling made ready the boat. But Mrs. Darling, fearing the loss of her husband and child, begged them to remain in safety. Grace, however, overcame her fears and persuaded her to help them in launching. Just as they set out, her courage again failed her, and she said, "Oh, Grace, if your father be lost, I'll blame you for this morning's work." Away went father and daughter on their errand of mercy. The wind had fallen, but the sea was still rough. At one moment the little boat was high on the crest of a wave, at the next it had sunk down into a valley of water which threatened to engulf it. Soon the cry of anguish from the wreck was changed to a shout of joy when the boat was seen approaching. At length the rock was reached, and by a desperate effort William Darling sprang ashore, leaving Grace alone in the boat. To prevent it from being dashed to pieces, she rowed back into the seething waters, and waited until her father could arrange with the survivors some means of getting into the boat. Had her courage or skill deserted her for an instant, her life would have paid the forfeit of her humanity. After a time her father signalled to her to come nearer, and one by one the survivors, half dead with terror and exposure, were transferred to the boat and taken in safety to the lighthouse. Then the same hand which had been the means of saving them attended to their wants for 3 days, when a boat was sent from the mainland to take them off. In the words of a writer of that day, "It is impossible to speak in adequate terms of the bravery shown on that occasion by Mr. Darling and his truly heroic daughter. Seldom, if ever, before had so grand a display of courage been shown by a woman, and, as we have already said, it stirred every heart." Congratulations flowed from rich and poor, from the Queen to the humblest toiler for his daily bread. All ranks and classes were proud that such a deed had been performed by an Englishwoman. As an acknowledgment of her gallantry, a public subscription was raised, and the sum of £700 was presented to her. The Royal Humane Society, which can surely be credited with having taken a calm and businesslike view of the case, also awarded gold medals to Grace and her father. 4 years later death claimed her for his own, and she was laid to rest in the ancient churchyard of Bamborough, where several years later a monument was erected over her grave. But no memorial was needed, for her courageous act will keep her memory green as long as men and women continue to love what is noble and true. Lonely and bleak, mid the seas that sunder their flowerless crags from the green north land, her islands shake to the surge and thunder of white waves racing to reach the strand. Lonely and bare, but above them lightens the memory fair of a shining deed, and a spirit presence the wild waste brightens, since love went forth at the cry of need. Oft as the night of that drear September broods again over sea and shore, still shall our hearts with pride remember how through the storm swift help she bore. Still shall we see, in fancy's vision, the brave little skiff from the lighthouse go, and, clad in the strength of love's decision, the girlish form to the oar bend low. Still shall we see in the dim grey dawning the drifting ship on the reef flung high, round her the hungry ocean yawning, over her stretched the hopeless sky. Rings again through the wind spray flying the moan of terror, the shriek of fear. Laugh the breakers as if replying with savage mirth to the cries they hear. Out on the rocks they crouch and shiver, the hapless few that have 'scaped the wave, scanning the waters with lips a-quiver, praying that God would send and save. See bright hope in their faces springing, lips are loosened, a cheer rings out, plunging, tossing, a boat comes bringing life for perishing, joy for doubt. Over the white-crowned surges leaping, hither through blinding foam she wins, still for the rock her course she's keeping, still the spume from the oar-blade spins. Saved, they crowd to the boat's frail shelter, eager helpers replacing now the hands that drove through the sea's wild welter, with love-born ardour the tossing prow. How can we speak her praise, or fashion a tribute worthy the deathless deed? Nay, that story of bold compassion no memorial words shall need. For far and wide girl hearts inherit her daring love, and in danger's hour shines out in 100 deeds the spirit of that sweet maid of the lighthouse tower. By Horace G. Grocer. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A titled medalist. The Tay, the largest and one of the most beautiful rivers in Scotland, rises in Loch Tay in Perthshire, and on its way to the North Sea passes through one of the most picturesque districts of Scotland. The scenery on the north is rugged and grand. Issuing from a lake, the stream is of considerable size at its source, and very soon becomes a broad and swiftly flowing river. About a mile from Loch Tay, the river takes a wide sweep, forming a semicircle in which lies the rich strath where stands Taymouth Castle, the seat of the Marquis of Breadalbane. The castle is surrounded by richly wooded hills, and the estate, which is the longest in Britain, abounds in game. In the early part of December 1888, the Marquis and a party of gentlemen were out shooting in the castle grounds, when it was decided to beat up the game on a small island in the middle of the river. Two keepers, named Jameson and Maclean, were accordingly ordered to cross over for this purpose. At this time the river was in spate, as it is called in Scotland, that is, high flood, and the current was running very rapidly. To prevent the boat from being swept away, a rope was attached to it, and the two men pushed off into the stream. When about half-way to the island, the rope somehow became entangled, the boat was upset, and the two men were thrown into the water. The Marquis, who had been watching their movements, saw the accident, and, knowing the extreme peril in which the keepers were placed, decided on instant action. Unbuckling his cartridge belt, he rushed into the river to render assistance, but the gallant nobleman was swept away by the force of the current, and with difficulty succeeded in reaching the bank. Meanwhile Jameson, who was an expert swimmer, struck out for the shore, and after a tough battle with the rushing waters, gained a place of safety. Maclean, however, was unable to swim, and was therefore rapidly borne along to what seemed certain destruction. Undaunted by his narrow escape, the Marquis determined to make another attempt to save the life of his servant. Without losing a moment, he ran quickly down by the side of the river for some distance, and on reaching a point which seemed likely to favour his efforts, he again plunged in, and after a severe struggle reached Maclean. Seizing the drowning man, the Marquis was able to bear him to the shore in safety. The rescue was not effected a moment too soon, for only a few yards below the spot where the daring deed was performed, there is a deep whirlpool surrounded by rocks, into which it would have been certain death to enter. For this courageous act, the reading of which reminds one of the dauntless bravery of the old Highland chieftains from whom the Marquis is descended, the Royal Humane Society unanimously awarded its silver medal. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Presence of Mind. Who has not read that charming book, A Voyage in the Sunbeam, in which Lady Brassey describes not only the various places visited in her voyage round the world, but also gives such a graphic picture of the life on board the yacht that the reader almost fancies himself to be one of the company pacing the deck of the snug little vessel. The owner and crew of the Sunbeam had already won for themselves considerable distinction by the rescue of the crew from a burning vessel in mid-ocean, when another gallant deed brought the name of the famous yacht again into enviable notice. On the 30th of September 1884, the Sunbeam was lying at anchor in Loch Carron, an arm of the Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Scotland, when the cutter was launched to proceed to the shore, about 3/4 of a mile distant. There was a very heavy sea running at the time, and when about half way, one of the timbers started, owing to the severe strain. The boat rapidly filled and began to sink. Mr. Thomas Ornett Brassey, the son of Lord Brassey, the owner of the Sunbeam, with great presence of mind distributed the oars among those who could not swim. Then he threw off his coat and advised his companions to follow his example. Scarcely had this been done when the cutter, now full of water, turned over in the rough sea. In the confusion which followed the upset, several of the men lost their oars, and serious loss of life would probably have ensued had not Mr. Brassey kept his wits about him, and by voice and action encouraged them to keep afloat. Seeing that Harry Timworth, a lad of 18 who had lost his oar and was unable to swim, was nearly exhausted, Mr. Brassey swam to his aid. Regardless of his own safety, he gave the lad his oar and supported him against the heavy waves. In spite of this assistance, the youth was swept away, and, losing his grasp of the oar, disappeared. Mr. Brassey, however, instantly dived and succeeded in bringing him to the surface. Fortunately, the accident had been seen by those on board the Sunbeam. A boat was speedily lowered and sent to the rescue. This was accomplished without mishap. Thanks to the prompt action and gallant conduct of Mr. Brassey, no lives were lost, and he received the Silver Medal of the Royal Humane Society. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Stories of the Royal Humane Society by Frank Mundell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hero of the Humber. The life-saving record of John Ellerthorpe, foreman of the Humber Dock Gates, Hull, is one which has seldom been equalled. During the long period of 40 years, he saved the lives of 39 persons, and we do not wonder that the people of Hull, proud of the fact that he was their townsman, gave him the name of the Hero of the Humber. The history of no other man more fully displays the value of the art of swimming. Ellerthorpe was born at Rawcliffe, and as a boy he spent much of his time in the water. His mother, knowing the evil results which often follow too frequent bathing, gave him many a good flogging, hoping to break him of what she regarded as a bad habit, but all to no purpose. On the first opportunity he again returned to the river. At the age of 14 he went to sea in a coaster, trading between Hull and London, and for the next 25 years he followed the calling of a sailor. On one of his voyages he had a very narrow escape of losing his life. He fell overboard during a gale, and was carried rapidly away from the vessel. Encumbered with his heavy clothes of thick pilot cloth, and wearing a pair of Wellington boots, he was unable to swim, and it required all his strength and courage to keep himself afloat. He could easily have thrown off some of his clothing, but in the pocket there was a sum of money which had been entrusted to him by his employers, and he determined to perish rather than to lose it. At length, after he had been in this perilous position for over half an hour, a boat from the ship came to his rescue. Ellerthorpe's exploits as a life-saver date from the year 1820, and from that time, almost until the day of his death, he never refused to risk his own life to save that of a fellow creature. He used often to say that he always had a deep and unaccountable impression that he had been born to save human life. The danger incurred in jumping into the water to the assistance of a drowning person is very great, so great, indeed, that many expert swimmers shrink from it, but to Ellerthorpe it became a kind of second nature. By day and by night, in summer and in winter, he never hesitated for a moment. From great heights to greater depths he plunged to the rescue of drowning persons, and brought them from under vessels at anchor, and from below rafts of timber, and what is more remarkable still, never without success. In after life, when recounting some of his experiences, he said, "In some instances they seize me by the shoulder or arm, then I have left hold of them, and, throwing both my arms into the water, I have managed to reach the shore. In other instances I found them so exhausted that they were incapable of taking hold of me, and in these cases I had to carry them as a mother carries her child. In 2 or 3 instances I thought they were dead, and bore them up in my arms, when suddenly, with great strength, they sprang on my head, and oftener than once under these circumstances I was on the point of being drowned. The first person whom he rescued was his father. The lad was at this time only 14 years old. Mr. Ellithorpe had charge of the ferry boat from Hessel to Barton, and one night, while they were crossing, a gale sprang up and the waves began to rise high in the Humber. A sudden lurch of the boat threw the old man overboard. Without a moment's delay his son followed him into the water, and when his father came to the surface he seized hold of him and managed with great difficulty to bring him to the boat. Telling him to hold on a minute, the boy swam to the shore, where he obtained help to lift his father on board, and they reached home without further mishap. In August 1833, a little girl named Mary Ann Day, about 6 years of age, fell from a steamer into the harbour. The screams of the mother and the shouts of the passengers brought Ellithorpe on the scene. Throwing off his coat, he plunged into the water, swam to the child and brought her ashore. The little one was none the worse for her ducking, and when she had changed her clothes, her mother brought her to thank her preserver. "Now," she said, "what will you give this brave man for saving your life?" "A kiss," replied the child, a reward which Ellithorpe was not slow to accept, and he afterwards remarked, "Oh, what a kiss it was! I felt myself well paid for my trouble." 2 years later he had the narrowest escape of losing his life. It was Sunday afternoon, and the docks were crowded with people. Suddenly the cry, "A man overboard!" was heard. Ellithorpe, who was standing about 100 yards away, rushed to the rescue, but found the greatest difficulty in getting near on account of the crowd of people, all anxious to see, without the slightest intention of doing anything. Pushing his way to the edge of the dock, he asked where the man had gone in. Someone said, "He went in just there," pointing between the wall and the paddle box of the steamer Calder lying alongside. Ellithorpe dived, and in spite of the muddy state of the water and the consequent difficulty he had in finding the object of his search, he succeeded in bringing him to the surface at the side of the steamer. Seizing hold of one of the paddle wheels, he clung to it to recover his breath, when those who were on board rushed to that side. This caused the vessel to heel over, and again rescued and rescuer were plunged overhead in the water, with but little chance of escape. Fortunately help was at hand. The captain, who had been asleep in his cabin, now came on deck, and seeing how matters stood, shouted, "You are drowning them!" His words had the desired effect. The people had not thought of that before, and they now hastened to make up for their thoughtlessness by rushing to the other side of the vessel, thus lifting Ellithorpe high out of the water. When they were taken out of the dock, both were insensible, and for a time the hero's life was in danger. Skilful medical attention at length brought him round, but he was ill for several days. The boy whom he rescued quickly recovered and went away, nor did he even come back to thank the man who had saved his life almost at the cost of his own. A few months later Ellithorpe was engaged as watchman on board the New Holland packet. On the night of the 19th of November 1835, A heavy gale was blowing, accompanied by blinding showers of sleet. He was in the act of closing the cabin door, preparatory to making everything snug for the night, when he heard a splash. Running on deck, he sang out, "Is anyone overboard?" The pier was deserted, and he received no answer. He peered into the darkness, but failed to discover anyone. Just as he was about to go below again, he thought he heard a groan at the stern of the ship. Looking over, he saw a figure struggling in the water, and at once dived. Almost before he was aware of it, he was seized by the drowning man, and they both sank. Unfortunately, the man had got his arms and legs round Ellithorpe in such a manner that he could not swim, and was therefore quite powerless. They rose again, and he managed by a desperate effort to free one arm and strike out for the shore. After a terrible and ever to be remembered struggle, in which they turned round and round many times, he reached the steps at the end of the pier. The rescued man took hold of the rail and walked up the stair without as much as casting a glance at his preserver, who, quite exhausted, had not sufficient strength to raise himself out of the water, but clung helplessly to the side. At length he managed to crawl to the top of the steps on his hands and knees. There he found the man whom he had saved, crying most piteously. Ellithorpe started for home, but he was so weak and ill that he must have perished from exhaustion had not the engineer of the ship come along at that moment. Seeing his mate in such a wretched condition, he asked him what had happened. "I have been overboard saving a young man," replied Ellithorpe, "and I feel very bad. I can scarcely stand." The engineer gladly assisted him, and on the way gave him a lecture on what he called the foolishness of his conduct. "Thou wilt be drowned some night, for there never was such a fool as thou art. Does thou think anybody but thyself would jump overboard on a night like this? No, there is not another such fool in England." After a change of clothes, Ellithorpe felt better, and was able to return to his duties. This rescue created great excitement in Hull, and a proposal was made that he should be allowed £2 per week to walk round the pier and docks, that he might be ready to rescue anyone who fell into the water. The Royal Humane Society awarded him the silver medal, accompanied by their thanks on vellum. Quickness, both of body and mind, are absolutely indispensable in saving life from drowning, and both of these qualifications Ellithorpe possessed in a remarkable degree. On one occasion his promptness of action was aptly described. He plunged into the harbour and rescued a boy, the son of one of his friends. The child's mother said to him, "What did you think, George, when you were in the water?" "Oh, mother," replied the little fellow, "I hadn't time to think. Mr. Ellithorpe caught me directly." One day a young lady, when coming ashore from a steamer, slipped from the gangway and fell into the water. Ellithorpe sprang at once to her assistance, and found that she was fast among some timber. Both were in great peril, for the tide was coming in. He knew that if it rose another foot, and found them still in the same position, both would be drowned. Prompt in thought as he was in action, he readily found a way out of the difficulty. Grasping the young lady in his arms, he told her that their only chance of life was to dive under the timbers. Without waiting for her to raise any objections, he put his plan into operation. The crowd on the pier thought that they were drowned, but in a few seconds they reappeared, and were taken ashore in a boat amid the hearty cheers of the bystanders. There was one strongly marked characteristic in the life of this remarkable man. He made a rule not to allow himself to be persuaded to accept any reward from those whom he rescued, though at the same time nothing gave him greater satisfaction than when they came and thanked him personally for his services. On one occasion, however, he departed from this rule. While he was shutting the dock gate, a woman came along, and, being in a hurry, she would not wait until the bridge was properly closed. In stepping across the gap, she missed her footing and went headlong into the water. Ellithorpe followed, and with little difficulty brought her to the bridge, where he held her until a boat came to their assistance. The woman was very grateful for her rescue, and never crossed over the bridge without calling at the watch house to inquire for her preserver. On the following Christmas she astonished Ellithorpe by calling at his house and presenting him with a duck. He knew that she was too poor to afford such a luxury, and therefore he refused to accept the present, saying that her gratitude was a sufficient reward for what he had done. She, however, was not of his way of thinking, and declared that she had intended all along to buy him a goose, but not having sufficient money, she had been forced to content herself with a duck. Under the circumstances it was impossible to refuse, and for the only time in his life Ellithorpe accepted a reward from a person he had rescued. As we have already said, Ellithorpe saved 39 persons. These included 3 little girls, 15 youths, 6 women, and 15 men. The Royal Humane Society conferred on him many testimonials of honour, besides the silver medal, and his townsmen presented him with a purse of 100 guineas. He died in 1868, and his funeral was attended by hundreds, many of whom came from different parts of the country to pay the last tribute of respect to one who had so often risked his life to save the lives of others. End of chapter 9.